they come from, by the
Across the
way?
Across the Bering Sea.
From Russia, right, from Russia. And actually, probably all human beings, the earliest found skeletons come from where? Africa. Okay. So when anyone says this is my land, it's God's land to begin with. Okay. So anyway, is that yes, of course, there were Chinese, there were Native Americans, there were Indians, there were all these people. But the Bible, yes, you could say, was it written by God? Well, it certainly was inspired by God, but is the autobiography of the Jewish people. Let's say, for instance, if I were ever to write my autobiography, okay, I I'm not I don't care about anybody else except me and my family. It's going to open up with my life story, okay? It's not going to be first of all, I don't know everybody. So the people I don't know are not going to be in my autobiography, and I'm only going to talk about the people who interact with me. So the same thing about the Bible. So yeah, there are other peoples in the world. And it's not a criticism of the Bible to say that whatsoever. It makes a lot of sense. The same way is, I'm sure you've all been to movies, and a movie opens up, and you see two people talking with each other. Let's say it's a husband, whatever, a man and woman, doesn't matter. Two people are talking, and you say, boy, this is going to be the whole movie. Two people, boring, I'm getting up. And all of a sudden, the camera opens up, and they're in the middle of a town square, and there's thousands of people around them. They're in Times Square in New York. Okay. So you can't, just because the same way is the Bible begins with Adam and Eve, but it would be foolish to say all human beings came from two people. That makes no sense whatsoever. And actually, the Bible doesn't say that either. Adam and Eve simply are people that talk. The Bible is talking about as examples of human beings, with all of our foibles, with all of our problems, with all of our dysfunctioning, to say the least. And how do I know this? For many reasons, logically. But the other is, the name Adam comes from the Hebrew word Adamah, which means earth. So that it's the human being coming from, we all come from the earth, from dust to dust, from earth to earth. We're all going to end up there, okay? And on the other hand, Eve, her Hebrew name is Chava, which guess what? Means she who gives birth, life. All women. Adam represents all men. Eve represents all women. They represent all families and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, an allegory, just an insight into that. Okay, so skipping ahead now, the early parts, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the key of these parts of the Bible is to get us to the second book of the Bible, which is what? The people of Israel under Moses, Exodus. Judaism, unlike some other religions, particularly Eastern religions, is not cyclical. The Buddhist karma, the wheel coming back onto itself in history, going back and around and around. But rather, Judaism is a linear religion going forward in time to where the end point is what? The Mashiach, the Messiah, the Messianic time. Judaism is constantly moving forward in time. So you're going to hear me talk about this today, and every single time alluding to it. Everything is moving forward in time. We got to get to that end point somehow. That's what God wants us to do, so that all ends up where it should, and the Messianic era, which we'll talk about, the Messiah, or in Hebrew. Everyone, can you hear me, guys? Yeah. How do I look? Okay. Okay. How's my pay? Okay. I'm trying not to put on ice outfit today. Okay. I even dressed myself. That was a miracle. Okay. So anyway, is that we're moving in time. So the question is that, think about it, because you know what the past is. They didn't. Somehow we got to get to Egypt to be enslaved in order to move to the next step, and that is to be free at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. So anyway, there's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. One of the most well-known of the 12 sons is this guy named what? Joseph. And of course, we'll be reading in a number of months from now, the story of Joseph from the Bible, from the book of Genesis. And Joseph, what? Is sold into slavery in what country? Egypt. Okay, so that now gets us into where? Ultimately, it gets all 12 sons down to where? Egypt. So that what? And of course, it's easy looking backwards to say, wow, this makes a lot of sense, okay? But you think about it. We're now in Egypt, and everything is going well when and I'm not going to go into the story of Joseph, okay, because otherwise I would never get this done in an hour and something. But rather what? Is that now Joseph and his brothers eventually, of course, there are no longer pharaohs who know about what Joseph did to save. Am I going to talk about if it's something I say here along the way? You don't never knew this or whatever. You have a question?
We all know.
Listen, okay, these parts, yeah. But if there's anything that comes up, please let me know. And therefore, what? They had to what? Joseph then, there were pharaohs who came about, didn't know how Joseph saved the life of the Egyptian people according to the Torah. And so therefore they enslaved us for over what? 400 years. A long time, obviously. Okay. Whether it's really 400, not 400, the times in the Bible are irrelevant, really. For instance, there's a very common thing, number 40. Okay, Noah reigned for 40 days and 40 nights. Moses was at the top of Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 is a common number. So if you were to say, wow, what is that, coincidence? No. If I were to translate the Bible, I would say 40 means, I would say they were left around for a long time in the desert. Moses was up at the top of Mount Sinai for a long time. 40 just indicates not literally a number of 24, 40 hours, but rather what? A long time. Okay. So now, where am I up to? Oh yeah. So anyway, they are now in Egypt and they're enslaved. And so the story of the Exodus from Egypt. But notice, if you remember from last time, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are not Jewish, definitely not, and they are not Israelites yet. Okay, although Jacob's other name, remember, he had to wrestle with the angel of God, and the angel of God, and he asked for blessing, and the angel changed his name to Israel. And so therefore, what? But he wasn't called an Israelite. He was a member of the what?
Hebrews.
Canaanite?
Okay. Well, when Canaan, they were Hebrews, which meant wanderers. They didn't have a homeland yet until after Moses.
Well, Hebrew
So-
means wanderer.
Hebrew means a wanderer or a nomad or an alien or an immigrant or a refugee, a homeland. So with Moses, he now is, of course, going to represent all of the sons of Jacob, bringing them all together because they're all slaves together. Each one of the sons, they have family, they have kids. So therefore, you could call each one a tribe if you want to, because the word tribe could mean a family. And ultimately, Moses, of course, stands at the top of Mount Nebo, watches them go off into the promised land, and they enter what was called then Canaan or Canaan. And you therefore who took over after Moses? Joshua. And Joshua settled them in the land of Canaan, but they weren't called Canaanites. They took on the names of their tribes. So therefore, if you were in the tribe of the son of Judah, you were Judahites. If you are Benjamin, Benjaminites. Naphtali, Naphtaliites. Yisachar, some of them are really hard to say, okay, especially in English. But anyway, you were known by the tribe that you lived in. Same way is that you are a Floridian. We could also say, however, that they were all children of Jacob, and thereby also what? Jacob's other name was Israel. So we could say now for the first time we had a concept of the Israelite because they were all children of Israel, and therefore what are we still called today? B'nai Yisrael. We are not called B'nai Yaakov, B'nai Jacob, okay? But we are known as B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel, but actually the children of whom? Jacob. I'm going to also throw out something very interesting to all of you, which actually I just learned this past week, because I love listening to these things. I'm driving around on different lectures and programs on YouTube. It's amazing what's there. And that is, we are not called B'nai Abraham. And you would think that we normally say, if I were to say to you, Hannah, who's the father of the Jewish people? You would say Abraham. But we're not called B'nai Abraham, the children of Abraham. We're called the children of Israel. Interesting, right?
Yes.
But I have no idea. This teacher, I forget which one it was, I listened to so many of these things driving around. And I just was amazed, but I said, wow, that's true.
Yeah, but isn't that
Well-
interesting to think about?
Well, because now it's going to lead us to the next part of all of this, I guess you could say, because Abraham was the one who presented, according to the tradition, the belief what? In one God.
Mhm.
So we added the spiritual part. But remember, you could not believe in God. You can be an atheist, but can you still be Jewish?
Mhm.
Of course, because we are part of what? A people. But the people part of all of this had nothing to do with Abraham at all. He was just a very significant in terms of it all, obviously, but only a very small part of it. Okay, so now we now are moving down. Moses was probably 1350 BCE. So we're now moving down. If Abraham 2500, so we're talking about a lot of years later. 1,000 years is a really long time, right? Okay, it's almost 4 times the history of the United States, let's say. So what do we know about this whole era? Very, very little. We have some recorded records in the Bible, but as much as there is to read in a Bible or a Torah, there's obviously a lot left out. So anyway, we are now what? Around the year 1000 BCE, because you have Joshua, and then you have the next book after Joshua is the book of Judges. They weren't judges like Judge Judy, okay, or Judge Wex, whatever it is, okay, or they were warriors, okay. Most of them were not judges in that kind of a sense at all. They're mostly all warriors, but they bring us down to around the year 1000. In the year 1000, the Israelites. Okay, so for instance, what? We are of the state of Florida, but we are Americans. So they were of the tribe of Judah, Yehudi, Jew in Latin, but also what? Israelites, because they were the conglomerate of Israelites. And so around the year 1000, they came to the prophet Samuel, Shemuel, which is my Hebrew name. And they said to him, you know something, everyone around us, they all got kings. We don't got no king. We want a king. And he would say, you don't want a king. A king is going to want to tax you because why? He's going to want to have a lot of houses. He's going to want to have a lot of horses and camels, and he's going to have a lot of slaves, and definitely have a lot of women because you can allow more than one wife. You're gonna be. What do you want a king? We want a king. So Shemuel, Samuel, the prophet, Navi is the Hebrew word for prophet. Of course, what is he going to do? He says to God, what should I do with them? God says, write them down, find him a king. And so we're now in the books of Samuel, in the Hebrew. We're going to go through the books of the Bible next time, the book of Samuel. And the prophet Samuel appoints the first king of Israel, whose name is Saul. Shaul in Hebrew, Saul. And let me see, I actually did some research for this whole program here. Okay. Saul ruled over the united tribes of the people of Israel from the year 1010 to 970 BCE. So that's pretty good. 40 years. It's a long time for someone to be king and not be killed. And if you read Samuel, he was really off the wall. He was very paranoid. He was probably maybe schizophrenic or delusional. And stuff like that. It's very interesting. Okay, but it's not a class in the Bible. Okay, then but the fact is we now had a king. Who was the next king?
David.
Saul? David.
Yeah.
So that David, I see what I did here. Okay, ruled from 970 to 931. No, I'm missing something here. That was David. Interesting. Okay, forget that. I guess I've left something out here. Okay, David ruled from 1010 to 970, and Saul ruled before him. And then Solomon was 970 to 931. Okay. Right. And of course, under Solomon, they built the first temple in Jerusalem was built, etc. But each one of them, what was their greatest achievement? Imagine from, let's say, around the year 1100, 1100 possibly, all the way to 931. So almost 270 years or something of rulership by kings, the entire united monarchy of all the 12 tribes. It ain't easy, I'm quite sure. And of course, you can read the Bible and the things that go on there. These are in the books of Samuel and Kings. But then it is in the year 930. Solomon has a problem. Solomon was the son of David. Solomon had 2 sons. Their names were Jeroboam and Rehoboam. and whatever it was, they didn't get along with each other, and they decided to split the kingdom of Israel into two parts. The first part in the north was Rehoboam, and its capital was Samaria. By the way, if you go to Israel today, you can actually visit parts of Samaria, and they've uncovered a lot archaeologically. And the southern part, with Jeroboam, was the kingdom of, was called the kingdom of Judah. What ended up happening was, in the year 722, so now about 200 years later, the first the northern kingdom of Israel was taken over and occupied by the Babylonians, and many of the Jews living in the northern kingdom were taken as refugees to Babylonia, which today would be Iraq.
The northern part of
Israel, right. The kingdom of, so that the northern kingdom called Israel was basically wiped out. The southern kingdom remained under Jewish hands and rulership, but the northern kingdom was basically taken away as captives to Babylonia. But this really became a very important moment and time in Jewish history for the following reason. Previously, with the temple in Jerusalem, and this is something really hard for us to grasp completely, is that the belief was that God was only the God of us and nobody else. The Philistines had their gods, the Canaanites had their gods, the Egyptians had their gods. We had only one God, and our God was in charge of everything. Like the others ones, they're the God of the wind, the God of the rain, and the God of, I really wanted a God the other day of the rain. I don't know what happened to that God. To stop the rain. I say, oh God, please stop the rain. And we need a God of the rain. But anyway, our God controls the rain too. But they all had, as you know, many gods. However, the fact is there was a problem, because the belief was that God's power station that God was located in was in the temple in Jerusalem. And in the Holy of Holies, the belief was, and it's hard to grasp this idea, that God was actually in the Holy of Holies. The spiritual essence, the core, thinking of a nuclear reactor, the core of God's energy was all in that place. So in 722, when they were taken away in captivity, and then in 587, the first temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, the question is, where's God? If you destroy the reactor, then is God dead? What's going on? And this became even more important because many of the Jews found themselves where? Outside of Israel. So even between 722 and 587, the temple still stood because it was in the southern kingdom. But the fact is, guess what? Is that they weren't on the land of Israel, and they had been taught from generation to generation that the God of the Jews, the Hebrews, the Israelites, only operated on Israel's soil. So now they're outside of Israel's soil. Do they have no protection? What's going to happen to them? Where is God? And so going back to the 8th century BCE, in other words, the 700s, you began to have the development of, and this is the important thing to get across here, of the Nevi'im, the prophets of ancient Israel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, who literally were able to say, God is in Babylonia, God is in Egypt, God is everywhere, and that God is in control of everything and everyone. And this is the development, I think I talked about this a little bit last week, and that is what we call monotheism. Monolatry is the belief that I have one God, you got many gods, but you got your own gods. I got my God, but my God is dead and your God. However, monotheism is that there's only one God completely. That's it. Shema Yisrael, only one God. And this then gave hope to the people of Israel. I'm looking for, oh God, where's the Bible? I have so many books. I don't know the Bible. Where?
God is everywhere. Don't look for him. He's in you.
All right, yeah, I know. I need a Bible.
Somewhere
Where?
Over here.
Oh,
Right there.
oh yeah, thank you. Oh, good. Okay, very good. Betty, you can read. That's right.
Rabbi.
And that's your
How's your
reward.
toenail?
Betty, you just got your reward.
Okay. Betty's going to read the following from the prophet Ezekiel. It was the 8th century BCE. Okay. And they're going to read first. I'll read the first paragraph. Okay. There's a lot of tricky words here. In the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, when I was in the community of the exiles by the Chebar Canal, in other words, he was in Babylonia in this period of time. The heavens opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, and then he's getting really specific here. It was Ezekiel. It was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. He was the last king of the northern kingdom. The word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, that's me, son of Buzi. So in other words, he's not just a nobody. He was the son of a priest by the Chebar Canal in the land of the Chaldeans, which is another way of saying Babylonians. And the hand of the Lord came upon me there. And this is when he literally saw a chariot landing, coming down in Babylonia. And Betty is going to read the last paragraph here, this one here, if we can see it.
Above the expanse over their heads was the semblance of a throne in appearance like sapphire, and on top, upon this semblance of a throne, there was a semblance of a human form. From what appeared as his loins up, I saw a gleam as of amber, what looked like a fire encased in a frame, and from what appeared as his loins down, I saw what looked like fire. Excuse me. There was
You excited
a
here?
there was a radiance all about him, like the appearance of the bow which shines in the clouds on the day of rain. Such was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. That was the appearance of the semblance of the presence of the Lord. When I beheld it, I flung myself down on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking.
Imagine.
Ooh.
And he said to me, "O mortal, stand up on your feet so that I may speak to you."
Wow.
We know who that is.
Or he said,
That's impressive.
That's in a robotic voice.
Translation actually says a semblance of a human form, upper half semblance of a human form.
that's what it says.
Well,
Because
you know
we were
what,
made, don't
Rabbi,
forget,
we
to-
talked
in the
about
image
Adam
of
and
God.
Eve being allegory. And of course, this can be
Well,
one too.
well-
You know, he saw a light, but he made it to be what he saw.
Yeah, well,
whatever
that's-
his mind saw.
It
But
could
that's-
be,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. Well, we don't know,
Could be an
but the fact
extraterrestrial.
is that imagine then he saw this vision, whatever you want to call it, okay? A spiritual vision. He obviously was spiritually oriented and could see certain things that other people couldn't. But imagine is that he left this area, and by the way, there was a book, the Chariots of the Gods, I think, by Donegan or whatever this guy was, who said that actually Ezekiel saw an alien spaceship landing. Okay, it was a UFO.
That's what
Yeah.
I thought.
Okay. However, the fact is, imagine then going back to town, and saying to these Jews who are so demoralized that God is dead, and he said, "Hey guys, I saw God," and he sat them down and described to them the day, the time, the place, and what did the chariot look like. And because he was such a charismatic type person, and he was the son of a priest, they believed him, and he gave them hope. And that's the key to these prophets, because they did something which was not happening before in Judaism. And that is to say, guess what? No matter where we live in the world as Jews, God is with us. And you might say, well, I know that, but imagine before this, they didn't know that. Okay? If I could convince all of you, every person in Delray Beach, that God is only in the sanctuary at Temple Sinai, that God is in our ark, and this is the only place that you can communicate with God, let me tell you, we'd have a lot more members than we got. Try that one. I'd try that one, boy. The Rigas would be thrilled. Yeah, boy. But imagine that Shabbat dinner for new members. Boy.
Wow.
Yeah. But in those days, they believed that. So imagine then is that, unfortunately for them, that temple was destroyed in 587. But what the genius of, whatever you want to say, was it God inspiring people, or was it coming from people seeing life and trying to make sense of the sufferings and the deportations from their homes, okay? Think of today of the Ukrainians, for instance, or leaving aside the politics of it, imagine these tens of thousands of Gazans, okay, who are now marching off to somewhere, God, where, who knows where they're marching. Whether you think that they deserve it or not, that's irrelevant. The fact is they're being marched off to somebody, somewhere. Okay, how is it? I mean, we're very lucky here. Right?
Here's the skeptic in me. This nuclear reactor who's being destroyed, and now God is no longer here. Who made up that story? Who decided that?
Well, that's what's called tradition. It was tradition. Somewhere along the way, I don't know what the day was, but they created this concept that God was in that holy place in the temple in Jerusalem.
Well,
He was
in the
dead.
Bible,
The priests,
the Bible says, you can't enter the Holy of Holies.
right,
Only the high priest once a year.
right,
And
yeah.
he's got to go through a ritual.
We have to keep, but it's hard to say how things develop. But remember, prior to the temple in Jerusalem was the Ark of the Covenant that was being schlepped around by the Hebrews on the way through the desert. So they already had a special holy thing. There are so many ways that one could interpret all of these different things. But holiness is the way that we see something that we believe is an indication of something greater than that thing. Okay, I mean, after all, why when we bring the Torah around, why should you kiss it? What mean? We invested with meaning. However, obviously, if we were to bring a Torah around through a Catholic church, St. Lucy on Highland Beach, or if I brought the Torah into a mosque, they wouldn't treat it the same way we do. They have their own holy things. It's the nature of human beings. Sammy, you got a question?
Well, it's if you imbue a place or an idea with holiness and spirituality, it thus becomes it, because you gather there for the spiritual. You don't gather there to eat. You don't gather there to do other things. You gather there to have a spiritual experience, to commune with God. So you give it that meaning. You give it that spirituality. You give it that home.
Yeah. There's I remember reading somewhere or other, there's this thing called Esculapian authority. So take, for instance, in that operation, when we go into for an operation with the doctor, you give up your ability of free will or the control of your own life to a physician when you go under that anesthesia. That's called Esculapian authority.
Mm.
So therefore, when I go on a plane, let's say, and aside from I'm giving over authority of my life to that pilot, right? Okay, but also if I say a prayer, I'm also giving it over to God and saying, God, watch over me in this plane so that everything goes well. We as human beings need to do that. But the question, and we'll talk about that another time today, because I want to move along here with the history, is the fact is, do human beings create the concept of God, or does God place that thought within us? Yeah, well, could be. Well, there was actually a Sufi mystic. I can't. Sharab, it's not in right now. There's a wonderful book called Alone with the Alone. And in that book, I remember reading once that he said the fact that you can even have the concept of God means that God put it there.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no reason why a finite creature like us that only has a minute of time of life compared to infinite time, the universe, obviously, is able to think of something so great and infinite. The fact that we can was put into us by God. That's a proof of God's existence. Anyway, moving forward, is that you have then this incredible ability to keep Judaism alive, because theoretically speaking, in terms of the scenario I'm sharing with you, is that when they found themselves in Babylonia, in Egypt, wherever, and if they could not be convinced that God was there also, and that they could speak to God there and talk to God and pray to God, and God's going to watch over them and bring them back to the Holy Land, they would have left as Jews and become whatever Babylonians worshipped and did. Okay. But Judaism stayed alive because of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the other prophets during this period of time who were there at that right moment, whether placed there by God, influenced by God, or simply they saw themselves, they had an insight. Where it comes from, we'll talk about that another time. So that when they return, and by the way, In 587, the first temple was destroyed. More Jews were taken out from the southern kingdom into captivity. However,
When did the southern kingdom fall?
in 587. So the first kingdom, the northern kingdom, 722. And again, the last of the kingdoms, the last of the tribes of the 12 tribes going back to the time of Joshua, right? And Jacob happened to be the tribe of Judah. And so therefore the word Jew in Hebrew is Yehudi, which means one of the tribe of Judah. The word Jew has nothing to do with God. Unlike Christianity, the word Christianity, Christian, Christ, the Jesus the Christ, okay? It is a theological statement. And therefore, when someone says to me, oh, a Christmas tree has nothing to do with religion, I say to them, really? Then take off the word Christ from it and just call it a mass tree or whatever, or a holiday tree. And by the way, some of you might, if any of you do, I don't mean to disparage anything you do, God bless you. But I do know friends who had Hanukkah bushes. They had to have a bush there in December.
What happened to the other? I thought there were 10 lost tribes of Israel. So what happened to, I mean, now you're saying there's only one tribe, Judah,
That was left.
that was left.
All the others were taken because the majority of them were in the northern kingdom.
And where did they go?
Kaput.
Oh, they were
Well,
killed off?
some people talk about the lost tribe. I mean, everyone wants to be it's amazing. When there's anti-Semitism, no one wants to be associated with Jews. But when things are going well for Jews, they want to be the lost tribe.
So where are they?
Well, there's one in Africa, there's one in
There
China,
may be.
there's one in a lot of different
Yeah,
places. That all of a sudden, there's a whole group, a bunch of people that in that religion, I mean, that culture,
yeah.
that are Jewish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lynn?
Yeah,
So
so it's,
the remnants to a great degree assimilated wherever
was.
they happen to be.
Mm.
it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and who knows? I mean, yes, I kind of saying a large number of Jews in 600s BCE actually end up going east to China area, Asia.
Mhm.
And there is a tribe, I
In
think
Africa, yeah, I
in
know.
The
Africa.
Jews of Feng Shui,
Yeah.
Feng Shui or something.
Well, that's China.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but in Africa, they actually did DNA tests.
Yes,
And they actually have the same DNA as a Kohen does.
Yeah.
So and
So
and
who
and they
knows where
like
they went,
and they like
you
and they like bagels and lox on Sunday morning. So you know that. Okay. So anyway, is that in 530 BCE, is that the Babylonian Empire was taken over by the Persian Empire, and the king of the Persian Empire, this guy named Cyrus, was more forgiving than the Babylonians and said to the Jews, hey, you want to go back home? Go back home. Gegerson to hate. No, he didn't know Yiddish. But he said to them, go back home and do what you want to do. Just pay me taxes. So many Jews, not all of them, went back to Israel. And they began the construction of the second temple in Jerusalem. So the important part of this section of this history is that we should have died off as a people once we went into exile. Many conventions ago, I can't remember when, the Central Conference of American Rabbis is that invited to the convention was the Dalai Lama. And he wanted to meet with people at our rabbis from our convention. And he actually addressed the group, which was kind of amazing. And he said the reason why he was so impressed by Jews and the Jewish people is because we have been in exile for 2,000 years off of our land and never gave up hope and never lost our identity as Jews. And he's concerned because obviously his country, Nepal, Tibet, was overridden by the communists, and they're dispersed throughout the world and whatnot. And of course, the lives are in danger. And he wants to ask us, how does he keep his culture alive to the time when they could all return back to their homeland in Tibet? So that's pretty cool, right? So we should have died, but we didn't. Okay, but keep in mind now is that also, yes, there were Jews coming back to Israel, and now they are Jews, no longer Hebrews, we got land, no longer Israelites, forget that idea. We're now Jews, because we're all of the tribe of Judah, at least that's the way it's set up. But many of them didn't come back. And they did not have, and eventually the temple in Jerusalem was rebuilt under a man whose name was Herod. The Romans occupied Israel. The Romans took over the whole world, the Persian Empire, of the Greek Empire rather, in the year 63 of the Common Era, before the Common Era, sorry, BCE, before the Common Era, and actually I skipped over one important part though, didn't I? Yeah. Okay, the Maccabees. Okay, going back a little bit in time to 167 BCE, is that the Greek Syrian Empire also had overtaken and occupied. They took over the Persians, and then you have the Greeks. And I'm not going to go over the Hanukkah story now, but the fact is that this is what's called the Second Commonwealth, because the first Commonwealth was Saul, David, and Solomon. The second Commonwealth was the period of the Maccabees, when the Hasmonean dynasty overtook Israel and controlled our country again under our own rule.
Which dynasty?
The Hasmoneans. The Maccabees were the house of the Hasmoneans. Hasmoneans. Well, that's a black chalkboard or whatever. Okay. So anyway, is that under the Roman, but consider this, is that throughout this period of time, now where were Jews? Some were in the Holy Land, but guess what? There were a lot of Jews living everywhere else. They were in Babylonia. They were in Egypt. They were probably in parts of Europe. They were everywhere. So the question then becomes why weren't they lost as Jews in these places? Because they had a heritage. So they might have had Torah scrolls of some sort, and they got together and they began to discuss, how do you live a Jewish life outside of the land of Israel, with a temple in existence or without a temple in existence? And you had people who were called Sophrim or scribes, there were no rabbis yet, but they were the teachers of the traditions and kept the traditions alive in various ways. If I remember my rabbinic training at all in my school, we have very few writings or actually records of the forms of worship outside of Israel during these centuries. But if I remember correctly, there were two things that when Jews got together, three things they focused on. One was saying the Shema, okay, because they had the scripture now. They had the Torah, scrolls, stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 10 Commandments. So number one is reciting saying the Shema, reciting the 10 Commandments, so they're spiritual and ethical people. And the third thing was, of course, continuing the traditions with Torah, okay, on some level. So that what began happening is that also the sharing of these stories and the discussion of how to live a Jewish life began to develop. Later on, and we're going to see this next week in terms of Jewish religious literature, two strains began to develop. One was called halacha, or Jewish law, how to live a Jewish life, wherever you live. And the second one was called Agadah, which means the stories of our people, to inspire us how to then live that life spiritually and ethically. And both of these aspects kept Jews alive wherever they were. Okay? So now we're moving along. So the second temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era by the Romans. And now, again, we should have died. Again, the second temple was destroyed, the place of our worship. Now, of course, you could say, well, but they didn't believe God lived there anymore. God was everywhere, and when God and all that kind of stuff that we already helped us to survive outside of Israel. But as you can imagine, the city of Jerusalem was still a very special and holy place, as it is to Jews to this very, very moment, right this very moment in time. So the question then becomes how do we survive that? We should have died then in the year 70 of the Common Era.
Well, you had a template, though.
A what?
There was a template, basically, from when the first temple was destroyed.
How to survive outside of it. But now, possibly because society became much more complex, and of course, different groups of rabbis or scholars or Sophrim had already been getting together and discussing Jewish law, Jewish life. Without the temple in Jerusalem, and actually even before the destruction of the temple, what we call today rabbis began to develop. In the temple period, the Roman period, there were three basically groups within the Jewish community. One was called the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the scholarly class of rabbis that began to develop, as well as also the artisan and cultural classes, the cultured people and artisans and craftsmen. You had the Essenes, who were the mystics and the spiritualists. And they lived in the caves outside of Jerusalem toward the Jordan Valley. And then the other group was called the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the upper wealthy class who were very much connected with the Romans and the temple in Jerusalem as well, and the priesthood. And unfortunately, as the priesthood began to continue in time, the priesthood was very much connected with the Romans because they wanted to stay in power. And so therefore, whatever Rome wanted, that's what the priests did, because they didn't want to be taken out of power or killed. Is everyone following me okay? Okay. So that turned out to be because the Sadducee class connected itself with the Romans, number one, who he hated, but number two is they connected themselves with the priestly class. When the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, they had nothing. They were kaput.
The Pharisees.
The Sadducees.
Why is that?
Because they were associated with the priests.
Yeah.
The priesthood came from the Sadducees.
Oh.
So the Pharisees ended up surviving, and they became the rabbis and the scholars. And they got together in a place in northern Israel called Yavna, even before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, and began to say, what's going to happen when the temple is kaput? What is going to happen when there's no longer a place for the priests to live, to function any longer, and say their offerings to God and prayers? We have to create and reinvent a new Judaism to survive the destruction of the second temple and the destruction of our homeland, because we don't know what the future is going to bring. Yeah.
Just an observation. It seems throughout these years that the common denominator is whether or not to assimilate to where they go or to stay within their own group. And it seems there's pros and cons to both.
Yeah.
And unfortunately there was a group that stayed together. And there must have been a portion that assimilated.
Definitely, just like today.
For survival.
For survival,
Yeah.
sure. The question is, how do you survive or how do you not survive? Exactly. And so this group of rabbis, and actually the head of the group of rabbis, Yehuda Hanasi, the word Nasi means the prince. He was like the rabbi in charge. They actually, as the temple was being destroyed and there's fighting going on, everything, they actually snuck him out of the holy city in a casket. The Romans would say, what happened to him? They said, oh, he's dead. They snuck him out in a casket up to the northern part of Israel, this place called Yavna, in order to survive. And these rabbis got together and they began to discuss the reinvention of Judaism. So they said, guess what? There's no longer this temple in Jerusalem, a place where we offered our sacrifices, our korbanot, our offerings to God with animals and grain and stuff like that. So now guess what? We will offer our prayers to God and our good deeds. And guess what? There were 3 times a day that they offered their sacrifices to God. They prayed to God, morning, afternoon, and evening. So guess what? We're going to have 3 prayer services every day: morning, shachrit, mincha afternoon, and mariv in the evening. And so therefore they created, the Pharisees basically created the Judaism that we are the recipients of today. If they had not been at that moment in time recreating Judaism, and imagine doing that, they had to create the prayers, they had to create the rituals, they had to create the halachot, the laws, the government, the customs that show us what to do and what not to do, as well as the belief system. Who is God? What is God? What does God want from us? What is our responsibility? So again, a large body of literature, which we're going to look at next 2 weeks from now, began to develop, and that is a body of literature of halachot, of Jewish laws, called the Mishnah and the Talmud. But also a large body of what are called midrashim, which are the spiritual insights into this whole thing that we call Jewish life. And the two must go together, are essential, both of them. Okay. So notice again, we should have died off. But this group of rabbis were able to get together and recreate Judaism. So unfortunately, and actually I'll talk about this next time a little bit, there were two Talmuds that were written. One was the Jerusalem Talmud, and the other was the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was written by the year 400 of the Common Era. It's based upon the Mishnah, which was written the year 200 of the Common Era. Okay. So anyway, what eventually, unfortunately, for many reasons, I can't tell you what they are exactly, but probably due to economic circumstances, particularly, the Jerusalem community began to die out. And so many of the Jews from Jerusalem moved north back again to Babylonia, not as slaves or as captives or deportees, but rather as Jews moving to another place where they can live a better Jewish life. And so they moved up to Babylonia. In Babylonia, another Talmud was finally written in the year 500 of the Common Era. And so it is that for a couple of hundred years, is that Jews did very well in Babylonia. From about 400 to about 800, they did very well in Iraq area, survived very well. There were two major academies of Jewish learning, in which they produced what were called the Geonim, Geonim, which were the rabbinic scholars. And we actually have many of their writings and their discussions about how to live a Jewish life in now Babylonia. There were definitely differences between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. For instance, the Jerusalem Talmud said when you say the Shema, everyone should what? Should stand. Whereas the Babylonian Talmud said everyone should sit. Okay. So there were different other kinds of many differences. Not many, but there were certainly quite a few differences between the two of them.
And when they moved to Babylonia, is it that the Romans were ruling?
No, Romans, no, at this point in time, you have what? The Holy Christian Empire.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was 300 something BC, a Common Era with the Holy Christian. Now Christianity is moving along.
Okay.
Yeah. But in Babylonia, obviously, still in the Eastern country, you had the caliphs and whoever was in charge of those kind of Eastern countries. So anyway, what began happening was, guess what? The Jews moved from Babylonia to where? West to Spain and Portugal. From the year 800, notice I'm moving along fine in time.
Oh, good.
Okay, only now, okay. Okay, in the year 800, between 800 and 1492, Jews were they lived everywhere. Okay, everywhere. Okay, probably even China, which is about the whole love of Chinese food, I guess. But the fact is that in Spain and Portugal, this was called the thrival. This was called the golden era of Spanish Jewry from around 800 to the Inquisition to the 1400s. And Jews were involved in everything in Spain, in terms of art, literature, government, moneylenders, everything. Yeah. Many of including probably Columbus, okay, first of all, there's a big discussion whether Columbus was even Jewish or not. And certainly whether some of the people on his boat were escaping the Inquisition is another question that's raised. Yeah, right, yeah.
What did you say, Hannah?
Who else could find us? Yeah. As well as certainly many of the major groups supporting financially these trips. You can imagine how expensive it was to be traveling around the world in a boat, were Jews, including the West India Company, which ended up, of course, sponsoring New Amsterdam, which became later on New York. It was all Jews.
But they didn't always have a choice. They had to leave many places.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Most definitely.
It was awful.
Yeah. By the way, the Cunard line was also owned all by Jews at one time, also, the Cunard ship line, which is why the QE2 was the first ship and the only ship ever to actually have number one, a synagogue built inside the ship. And I officiated at that service, and inside when Judy and I did a crossing once. And also was the only ship ever to be built with a kosher kitchen in the ship. No longer, but they did, because the owners of the Cunard line were all Jewish.
Rabbi, weren't a lot of the people that were on the ship and boats back then? Like the dregs, a lot of criminals and.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But I just point out Columbus, there could have been in 1492, some of them could have been Jews trying to get out of the Spain and Portugal. rather than dying, obviously. But the fact is that everything was going well for the Jews in Spain. And you have a number of rabbis, and we'll talk about him next time, called Maimonides, who was 11th century in Spain. He was so famous they ended up in a hospital after him in Brooklyn. Okay, but the fact is that you had the great minds writing incredible books about Jewish law and tradition, etc., etc. But again, even these great rabbis contributed to moving on in Judaism, because guess what? Just like in today in America, to some degree, all this unfortunately changing due to anti-Semitism, when things go well for Jews, quite often they forget their Judaism. So take, for instance, Maimonides. One of his greatest books of all that he wrote was called the Moreh Nevuchim, in Hebrew and English, the Guide for the Perplexed. And the book was basically a response to Jews giving up on Judaism and being impressed by Aristotle and Greek philosophy, and saying the rational mind of Aristotle is the way to find God and to be an ethical human being. I don't need this Jewish stuff anymore. So Maimonides wrote the Guide for the Perplexed for that purpose. It's very much of a rational guide to living Jewish life. And he actually says this in the book, that it's a response to those Jews who are leaving. So again, over and over again, you have these incredible minds and people, groups of people, or in this case, singular people. The question also became is that Jews had enough of this Talmud stuff and all this stuff and studying and got so confusing. So Maimonides and others as well began to write what's called Codes of Jewish Law. Maimonides' greatest work, another great work, was called the Mishnah Torah. And I have the whole set back in New York. It's huge, huge. And what he did was, he was the first person to take all of the laws of the Talmud that pertain to Jewish life 2,000 years, well, 1,000 years before, and put them in a code and say, this is what you do now, this is what you do then, this is what you do this situation. It's a code of Jewish law, leaving out all the discussions that are in the Talmud and just saying, this is why you live, this is what you do. And why was that important? Because Jews were what? Forgetting what to do, what to practice, what to do. Okay. So, what happened in 1492 was devastating to the Jewish people. Again, not all Jews lived in Spain and Portugal, but obviously thousands did. And they were being forced by the Catholic Church to either to convert to Catholicism or to be burnt alive at the stake, and many were. So many of them were able to flee. And by the way, one of the places they went to was north to Amsterdam, to Holland, which was kind of a free place to get to. However, during this period of time, but it was before that too, actually, probably going back a couple of hundred years. But during this period of time, there was the development of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, in its strongest way. One of its most important works, and I have all the volumes there of the Zohar, is the Zohar, and actually I have another set now of the Zohar down there. And one of the temple members will win that someday from me. Okay. We'll see who goes to the top of the class if you have enough room in your library. Because it's 23 volumes.
Oh, God.
Okay. Anyway, the fact is the Zohar was a mystical, Kabbalistic commentary to the Torah. But what was one of the things, so to speak, experiences in Jewish life that Kabbalah addressed? Why do bad things happen to the Jewish people? Why is there evil in this world? And the Kabbalah, unlike any other philosophy, so to speak, or theology, was able to say that it is a part of the system that God has created, because there is going to be evil, there is going to be suffering in this world, and what our role in this whole schema is, we as human beings have to then address the evil in the world that is a part of existence, the suffering in the world, which is a part of existence, in order to rectify it, to better it, in order to overcome it and move through it, to rectify it and to change it, to do something about it.
It's mostly about you yourself.
Well, yes, but I'm just speaking about the people of Israel now. It had a very, very strong influence on the Jews suffering under the Inquisition, which is probably the Zohar was first printed, I think it was in 1330 or something of the Common Era. right? Obviously, the 14th century, in the midst of the Inquisition that was beginning in Spain, and Jews being killed or thrown out. For a matter of fact, Maimonides, there's a very famous letter that was written to him by a number of Jews being affected by the Catholic Church and the Inquisition, saying to him, what are we going to do? How are we going to survive as Jews? And he said, don't worry about it. Convert outwardly to become a Catholic, which they Moranos, and when you can later on escape and go back to living a Jewish life someplace else.
Maimonides?
Yeah,
said that?
Maimonides said that in his very famous letter to, I think it was I forget which country it was, but the fact is that there are three reasons that a Jewish person, according to the Talmudic law, should give up one's life rather than live. One is if someone comes to you and says, kill that person over there, I'm going to kill you. You should rather allow your life to be taken. The typical Talmudic comment is, how do you know that person's life, his blood is any greater than yours? The other is, if someone comes to you and says, to a male, obviously, rape that woman, otherwise I'm going to kill you. You should rather die than violate that woman. And the third one is, if someone comes to you and says, worship my God over there and bow down to that statue, or I'm going to kill you, the Talmud says that you should give up your life rather than become idolatrous. Maimonides said no. The first two, yes. The third one, no. Because you can convert outwardly, and then sometime in the future, you can go back to your Judaism. The other two, once you do it, you can't take it back. Okay. So you can see then the importance of, and I'm going to go more into Kabbalah later on, obviously. But the fact is that Jewish mysticism began to develop because it began to say that there is an operative principle in existence that is established and moved by God, that we as humans can only partially understand, but is why the things are happening to us, why the suffering is, the Jewish people is going through the suffering, and it didn't necessarily address individual suffering, which is a whole nother story. Now, moving along, the Jews left Spain and Portugal, they come to Europe, etc., and now I'm into the 17th century. Okay,
Wow.
in the 17th century, you began to have Jews primarily obviously, yes. What does that mean? There were Jews certainly in other parts of the world again. There were Jews in Africa, North Africa. There were Jews in the Middle East. There were Jews in China. They were all over the place. But there was a very, very large Jewish community in Eastern Europe. And in Eastern Europe, millions of Jews, there were basically two different segments of the Jewish population. There were those that lived in the large cities, Vilna, Warsaw, etc. And there they were very well educated. Many of them had money, because you can earn money in a city, obviously. And the whole life, many of them, they had a very large Torah study class. And I'm just generalizing and kind of simplifying this, but the belief was that the way to get to God was what? Through the study of Torah. And the more hours you spent in where? The yeshiva, studying Torah, in a process called pilpul, which means simply studying for the sake of studying, you will find your way to God. But then there was another large segment of the Jewish community out there in the fields, in the farms of Poland and that whole area. They didn't have a lot of money, and obviously, as farmers and all, they have to work day and night, and they don't have time to be sitting in a yeshiva studying. So that they were basically an illiterate group for the most part. They weren't well versed in Torah or even able to read. So one group felt connected to God, and this other group certainly didn't. As well as life was miserable again for Jews. Why not? Okay. In the 1600s in Poland, they were the Cossacks. And the Cossacks is horrible as what occurred on October 7th by Hamas. The Cossacks did the same thing. They would ride through a town in Poland, simply round up all the Jews, put them inside a synagogue that was made of wood, and set the place on fire and kill everyone. And there are stories similar to, unfortunately, the Hamas. It's almost like they read their playbook, that actually they would take a pregnant woman, and while she's still alive, rip the fetus out of her and then kill her.
Jesus.
Okay. The Cossacks did the same things. And they did them to millions of Jews throughout this area. So life was miserable. And again, when life is miserable, quite often we as human beings turn to whom? God. But the fact is that these peasants and out there in the fields, where is, I don't know, I can't read a prayer book. I can't read the Torah. I got to work here taking care of the flock. And so there was a man whose name was Eliezer ben Israel, Israel's son of Eliezer, or what became known as the Baal Shem Tov. And he became the founder of the Hasidic movement. And what he began to say was, you know something? You can be illiterate, but you can feel God within you. And of course, I'll just tell this beautiful story, there's so many stories, and this is one of the essential parts of Hasidic lore. There was this shepherd boy, and whenever he would see something beautiful happening, a beautiful sunrise or sunset, or a baby calf being born, he would whistle, because that's the way how he expressed his spiritual feelings toward that which is greater than him that we call God. He didn't know anything else. And one day his father came to him and said to him, son, Shmuel, you're 13 years old today. Let's go to the big city and have your bar mitzvah. Because that's what you do when you're 13. A Jewish boy, you got a bar mitzvah. And so they went into Vilna, whatever the city was. And the shul was, of course, it was a Saturday morning, Shabbat morning. The shul was packed to the gills because everyone went to shul those days. And anyway, they go in. And the father says to one of the gabayim, one of the ushers in the back, it's my son's bar mitzvah today. So they immediately separated father from son and moved the boy right up to the bima, right up to the ark where the rabbi was. And the boy, they put a talit on him, they put a prayer book in his hand, but he couldn't read it. He couldn't. But he held on to it very close to his heart. And all of a sudden, he was just so enveloped by the singing and the movement and the great sense of real prayer within that sanctuary, that guess what do you think he did? He started to whistle. Well, it's forbidden to whistle on Shabbos in a shul. So all of a sudden, all of the men, what is that? They all stopped praying, davening, and they started screaming, who dares to desecrate the Shabbos? That boy over there. Get that boy out of here. Kick him out of the shul. He's a great sin against God. Kick him out. So these guys take him and they start to bring him out to the back, and they're going to kick him right out the back door. And all of a sudden they hear from the bima, it's the rabbi. And everyone is totally silent with the boy in these guys' arms. And they turn and the rabbi says, bring that boy back up here. And they're amazed. And they say, why, Rabbi? He desecrated the Shabbat. And he said to them, how do you know that his whistles are not more acceptable by God than all of your prayers? Bring him up here and let him pray. And the Baal Shem Tov would tell stories like this to these illiterate peasants in the middle of nowhere in Poland, who probably the next day the Cossacks come through and kill them anyway, and gave them hope and gave them the belief that God was with them. So again, notice all along the way. But now I'm going to finish with this for today, and that is, of course, Reform Judaism. Interestingly enough, Reform Judaism picked up on Hasidism, although I don't think any Hasid today, Satmar or anyone or Chabad would ever agree to that. By the way, I think all Jews are Reform anyway, because everyone does what they want. But anyway, no matter what they are, they just figure it out and they just call it other names. But the fact is that going back into the 1800s, okay, 1800s, so about 100 years after the Baal Shem Tov, the 1700s, in Europe also, but not in Eastern Europe as much as in Germany, okay, mainstream big Jewish life in the big cities like Frankfurt, is that there was now another problem that Jews were confronting, a different kind of problem, because in the 1700s was the age of enlightenment, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. You can now be what? Free. Throughout Europe for hundreds of years, Jews were placed into what? Ghettos, and were forbidden to be the citizens of the countries they lived in. You couldn't go to a university. You couldn't do anything. You were forced to become, like Hannah said before, money lenders or certain occupations. We were forbidden. We were actually exiled from England for 400 years. No Jew was allowed to live in England. Okay, and in Shakespeare never met a Jew in his life. And that's why the Jews like Shylock in his plays are all stereotypical Jews. You never met one. Okay, so the fact is that when the walls of the ghettos began to come down in Venice, in Italy, and in Germany, and in France, and in everywhere else, and Jews were allowed back in England, guess what? All of a sudden, Jews had a choice that they hadn't had in hundreds of years. For the first time, they can go to the University of Berlin or the Sorbonne or whatever. And therefore, they could become what? Christian. Because for the first time in hundreds of years, they could also convert.